My guest this morning is not a stranger to the Reading Circle with Marc Medley. He's been on the show at least 2 times before. At least 2. It might even be more than that. But I know Caseen has been here with me a couple of times, and he's going to join me again today. And Caseen Gaines is an author, director, educator, and popular culture historian. His work has received praise from media outlets around the world, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, NPR, and The Hollywood Reporter. His latest book, When Broadway Was Black, the triumphant story of the all-black musical that changed the world, was published in February 2023. It is the expanded and revised edition of Footnotes, the black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way, which was released in May 2021 for the centennial of the groundbreaking Broadway musical Shuffle Along. He is the author of We Don't Need Roads, the making of the Back to the Future trilogy, which led to his television appearances on Entertainment Tonight and Netflix's The Movies That Made Us. He is also the writer of the officially licensed E.T., The Extraterrestrial, The Ultimate Visual History, and The Dark Crystal, The Ultimate Visual History. His other work includes A Christmas Story, behind the scenes of a holiday classic, and Inside Pee-wee's Playhouse, which earned Caseen a 2012 Independent Publisher Book Award. Caseen has been published at Vanity Fair, IO9, and New York Magazine, and has written original features for Rolling Stone, the AV Club, Fathery, and Decider. He is also a consultant and ghostwriter on several narrative nonfiction projects. He holds a master's degree from Rutgers University in American Studies, where he focused on racial representation in popular culture, and in addition to writing, is co-artistic director of a nonprofit theater company he founded in 2005, and a high school English teacher in New Jersey, where he has taught for 16 years. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Reading Circle microphones, Caseen Gaines. Caseen, good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you so much.
Great. I'm glad you can hear me. I'm always making sure we make that first connection on the air. I know we make, we connect on the phone 5 minutes ahead of time, but I need to make sure everything is working like it ought to, and it is. So, man, welcome back. You all, the listening audience, you need to know I knew Caseen before there was a Caseen. Because Caseen's mom and his aunt and all of them, we all went to school together. My sister and I, Caseen's mom and his aunt, we went to School 15. As a matter of fact, they lived right outside of School 15. There was the complex there that was right next to the building, and Caseen's mom and aunt actually lived right there, right next to the school. So Caseen, we were like kids. So that's why I say I knew you before there was ever a thought of a Caseen. So welcome back. As we said, whenever we were talking a couple of minutes ago on the phone, and I'm looking at your website and I'm reading over the bios, like we're into continuous progression here. That's a wonderful thing that you are, you haven't quit, you haven't stopped, you haven't given up, you haven't just, you're still on the move. So, what I always like to do, even though you've been on the show before, I still like to take the listening audience back to kind of like, well, where did this interest and where did all of this begin in terms of writing and going to school and getting your master's and then being a teacher? And because being a teacher nowadays is something in and of itself. But let's talk a little bit about where did this all start?
Yeah, it's hard to sort of say. It's funny because I've always sort of loved stories, and I don't know if I always put it that way, but whether it was telling stories about things that happened to me or telling stories about things that happened to other people, or sometimes I have some really vivid memories of watching old Twilight Zone episodes and like on the playground telling my friends about this episode and that episode, and then this happened, and then here's the twist and this character, and it's just always been something that I enjoyed doing, and I think something I do relatively well. I don't often give a straight answer to a question. I'm probably doing it right now in terms of I take the long way around, but I think sometimes that can be the more fun way, and I think that's something that writers do oftentimes, and certainly I think something that teachers, particularly English teachers, do as well. So I don't know. I've always been interested in like writing books, and even I wrote like comic books when I was like in third grade, even though I can't draw worth a lick, but I, would kind of just have like stick figure comic books and try and make them kind of interesting and fun. And then it was probably in college. Well, it definitely, I guess, was in college when I started just reading so much more, right? Like that's kind of the great thing to me about college, especially when you're majoring in things like journalism and English, where you're just exposed to so much work, and it's not always fiction. Sometimes it's really interesting nonfiction that kind of just changes your worldview or is really interestingly written. And I think a lot of people have a perception of nonfiction books being very dry and very boring and all about very serious academic things, but there are nonfiction books about fun things, about TV, about media, about really kind of esoteric seeming things in society. And I ended up kind of having someone recommend to me at some point in time when I was kind of talking about an interest I had in Pee-wee's Playhouse, the show from the 80s, that, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I hadn't really, I hadn't any more than, I guess, anyone else who's ever read a book thought about writing a book, like in that sort of way. But I went to the bookstore and I picked up some books on how to write books, and I picked up some books on how to reach out to publishers about getting your book published. And I just took lots of notes on those books and kind of followed their common advice to a T, and ended up with a book deal for that Pee-wee's Playhouse book. And that sort of put me on a trajectory when, it went from something that was sort of like, when you write one book, it's your book. And then once you've written, 2 or 3, then you write books, plural. And I would definitely say at this point that's where I am, is, I'm on that sort of path now where it's more than just a hobby. And that's kind of a cool thing to be able to do.
So in terms of, I heard you say you really got into reading whenever you got in college. As a child, did you read a lot? Because what I found in many cases, in terms of the guests I've had on the show, many of the authors say I was an avid reader as a child and therefore became a really good writer. What I just heard from you was you really got into reading once you got in college.
Yeah, as a kid, I did love reading. I used to, there were these things called Goosebumps books. They were these like these little horror books that came out, it seemed like every month or every other month. They were these, like maybe 150 page books. But when you're a little kid, that's, that might as well be War and Peace, right? But I would devour these books. But I can say I probably, as an elementary school kid, read books all the time, and then in middle and high school really kind of fell out of it, and even in college, I don't think I was reading for fun so much, but then I was still reading even if it wasn't recreational. So, as a kid, I loved reading, and I really did. I read literally all the time. There was always a book in my book bag. I was kind of that kid about it, but I definitely did fall off. And now I read all the time. And without trying to be conscious about it, but I think last year I read something like 24, 25 books, and just things that I find interesting or things that people have recommended to me. So it's a practice that I've definitely gotten back into in adulthood.
So in many conversations, I introduce race into it because race is important, what other people think so or not. And one of the things when I have a conversation with someone like you is we actually debunk myths and stereotypes, because the myth and stereotype is so many, like you're breaking and debunking so many of them in terms of just reading your bio and what you do. Because many folks think, first, black people in general don't read, and certainly they think nothing good can come from an African American male. And certainly you are debunking all of that, because yes, you do read, yes, you do write, yes, you do teach, yes, you do speak. You're doing all these things that stereotypically folks try to act as if African American males can and won't do, and that's just not the truth. That's why I always introduce it, to make sure I let folks know I don't want to hear this. There's no qualified candidates. I don't want to hear this nonsense about we couldn't find anybody to fill that position who is an African American. I don't want to hear that, because there are folks that are out there that can do it. You just haven't looked, or either they haven't applied for whatever reason. I don't know. But I mean, do people kind of look at you or see you as an outlier, or as an exception to the rule?
You know, it's such an interesting question, because my first several books were really about popular culture, movies. Like I said, you know, Pee-wee's Playhouse, A Christmas Story, Back to the Future. And what I found interesting about my latest book, When Broadway Was Black, is that now I start to pop up on these lists of, like, you know, black authors you need to check out, or, you know, the top reads of this year written by black authors. And it's funny, because I kind of take a step back and have to go, like, well, wasn't I black when I was writing about Pee Wee Herman also? Like, did I just become black,
right,
like, in the last, you know, 6 months? And it's kind of an interesting, weird thing that I'm still sort of wrapping my head around, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, the publishing industry is a very, very, you know, white space. I mean, that's just the truth. I mean, if you look at your editors, you look at your agents, you look at your, certainly even the salespeople, the people that once your book is written and done at the publisher, they then go out and they talk up your book to the people that buy for Barnes & Noble or Amazon or, you know, Books A Million or any other bookstore around, or certainly independent bookstores. And so those people, by and large, are white as well. The people that own the bookstores, by and large, are white. And so you're, even in ways that you don't realize, once that book has really, you know, left your computer and started to be on its trajectory to being in someone else's home, there are people along the way that, you know, the way that I sort of like to describe it is you don't have to have bad intentions. You just sometimes don't get it. You know, you don't get why there might be an audience for it. And I think that, you know, I read an article not that long ago where someone in publishing described it as, like, even when there are books written by black authors, by and large, you know, talking about the black community, what sells are books that they think, you know, the publishing industry thinks will be of interest to white readers.
Correct.
Because there's still this perception that, you know, that white people are the only people that buy books. You know,
that's correct.
And so it is a little bit of a challenge. And I think, you know, after 2020, you know, the publishing industry has been taking some steps to kind of let more people through the door and, you know, that sort of thing. But it's still disproportionately challenging for, you know, black authors, especially black male authors, and black women as well. You know, I don't want to, you know, it's not make it just a male thing, but it really is a challenge for black people in general, just to sort of sometimes see their work, or have their work be heard. And also, I think, to me, the biggest challenge is having to explain and get buy-in as to why there is an audience for this particular idea or this particular work.
No, absolutely, because we're living in a time right now where folks are making every attempt to ban books.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you go down to Florida, you got a governor down there who's trying to ban books and to ban information and to limit. I mean, it's counter education. The fact that you're trying to ban education in education, that's counter. That doesn't make any sense. And yet, that's what they're trying to do. And they're trying to say, you can't mention the fact that Rosa Parks was an African-American woman. Well, that's part of the story. Or we had a situation wherein a film was being shown about Ruby Bridges and the parent complained, and they're talking about banning the film on Ruby Bridges. Well, I mean, come on, really? Seriously? So now juxtapose that to what you just said, because I'm just kind of funny that way. That's the way kind of like my mind works and processes. I will literally walk into a Barnes and Noble or a bookstore and just kind of look around to see just how many black families are in there. Many times, and in many instances, I am pleasantly surprised. There are folks who take their kids, black folks, African-American folks, Hispanic folks, who take their children to bookstores as well. So when it's this constant message of catering only to one group, that's where we keep getting into this situations that we're always seem like we're into. And that's why I asked the question, because you're debunking many stereotypes here. The fact that you're a teacher, because in education, it is very hard for whatever reason to get or recruit African-American males to go into teaching. And not only that, like I said, you love to read, you love to write, and the things that you're writing about is not necessarily like black fiction or ghetto fiction or urban jive or whatever. You're not writing about that per se. I mean, because when we start looking here, what was your first book? Was Pee-wee your first book?
Pew was the first one.
That was right. And you were on the show for that one. Because like I said, I know you've been here. This is at least your third time on the show. And I remember we did Pee-wee. I remember that one. And I believe we did the one about Rhodes, about the trilogy. I think you were on for that one.
So.
But I mean, again, you're kind of like showing folks that no, what you think about me and what you think is off base. And the thing is, I love the fact that I have the opportunity to speak with you, but there are more of you out there. Mm-hmm. There are more me's out there. And people try to always portray and pretend like, no, we don't exist. And that's not true. That the only thing we can do is be a thug, tote a gun, kill somebody, rob somebody, jack somebody, so forth and so on. And that's just not the truth. Now, that's what the perpetuation is, but it's not necessarily the truth. So when, like, say, for example, let's go back to Pee-wee's Playhouse. Let's go back to the first book. How did you even, what made you come up with that concept? Was it just the fact that you love Pee-wee Herman, or what is it that you were trying to get across?
Well, I think there's one thing I want to add to what you were just saying, which is, I think you can't underestimate, how much some of that is by design. When you tell people they don't belong in a certain space, or they don't have certain characteristics, or they don't have certain abilities, or they don't have certain talents, you keep them out of those spaces. People don't. I think about, I'm not very good at math, and I have read a lot on the fact that a lot of black and brown people they learn, whether it's from their parents who maybe weren't good at math, or from schools that maybe say, well, look at our math scores, those kinds of kids struggle at math. And they learn and internalize from a very young age that math isn't something that you're necessarily going to be good at. And so when they are faced with some sort of struggle in math, instead of it being, look, you're struggling, it's hard, let me help you work through it, let's figure it out, you can do it, it leans more towards, well, math isn't for everyone. Well, you only have to take 2 years of math. Well, and people start to self-select out of math. And I think that is true when you say to people, well, black folks don't read, they don't buy books, they don't go to Broadway, they don't whatever, that if you hear that you don't belong in a certain space, or there aren't a lot of people like you in a certain space, then why would you go?
Correct.
So, there are lots of states, that I have I have no interest in living in, I don't believe that those states are for me, and so I'm not eager to live there. But if I moved there and I found out, there are a bunch of people that live that look like me that live there, I would be very surprised to find that out. And maybe more people would go there that look like me, and that might upend the people that are there. So I didn't want to jump on your question, but I just wanted to go back to that.
No, I could not agree with you, and I'm glad you went there. I mean, that's kind of the way, I love the way the show operates. That's why I don't operate off of a question list. It's very informal, very conversational, just like if we were having a conversation on the phone, and that's the way I want it to be. That's always been the objective. So absolutely, and you're absolutely 100% correct, because see, I try to help folks connect the dots with, what we're talking about in terms of, because I know I've been in corporate, I've been in the military, I've been in education, I know the religious field, I know the fraternity field. I mean, all of those different, and I've traveled the world. So I know what I'm not talking about what I think. I'm telling you what I know and what I've experienced. And I know how folks still in 2023 try to pretend or try to say how they view African American males or African Americans or people of color. And so it's all relative. It's all connected. And the fact that you're out there as an author, and I read the bio, the fact that you're continuing to progress, to me, that's big. That's major. And the story needs to get out there and more. And that's why I'm always glad to have you on the air. I'm always glad to have you on the show, because more and more people need to hear and understand. Oh, it's not always, it's like, first off, I don't understand this whole notion of the race thing, and maybe that's why it keeps getting exacerbated. The country has been exposed to an African-American male as a president of the United States for 8 years. The country now has been exposed for almost 4 years an African-American female as the vice president. So it's not like they don't know who black people are, and it's not like they don't know what black people can or cannot do. It's just a matter of, I'm going to keep on perpetuating what I want to keep perpetuating because that makes me feel better or that makes me look good. All right? There's no way in the world you could still be sitting there talking about someone who's been impeached twice and now indicted as the best president we've ever had, other than you just want to be stubborn. And I'm not going to get down that line, down that road, but it is what it is. So all I'm saying is there are other groups and other folks who contribute to the success of the world and the country, and it's not just one dominant group. All right. So I'm always proud and grateful to have somebody on you like the show, particularly when, like I said, you happen to be the product of someone that I grew up with. Someone that I grew up and went to grammar school with and have known, forever. My sister to this day still keep in touch with your mom. And so, we're really proud of you. And cause we know it can happen regardless of what folks are trying to act as if it can't happen. Matter of fact, if you weren't already hired, I try to hire you in my school. I have an all boys school. It's a leadership school, grades 3 to 8. And I am constantly working on their self-esteem, letting them know, don't you ever let anyone try to make you feel less than you are because of your gender or your race or your ethnicity. And so that's our constant message on a daily basis at my school. And that's another reason why I go down this road when I'm having this conversation. So then we get into, we did Pee-wee's Playhouse. Because the other thing about your titles and books, like I said a couple minutes ago, you don't necessarily peg them to, it got to be the urban experience. You're talking about E.T. You're talking about, Back to the Future. You're talking about Pee Wee Herman, which for the most part, those characters or those storylines are for the most part, Caucasian storylines per se.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're all sort of, they're all back behind the scenes books. So the process for all of those books were I interviewed the cast and crew. It was a little bit challenging. Well, I guess a little bit challenging on the first couple books because I hadn't written anything. I hadn't written anything. I'd worked for my school newspaper. At Rutgers, and I didn't even write all that much for the school paper, to be honest with you, but I wrote a little bit. And so I reached out to some people that worked on Pee-wee's Playhouse. And, you asked before about what was sort of my interest or what brought me to that story. And to me, it was just sort of an interesting story. It sounds kind of corny, but I just thought it was an interesting story to tell about someone who was an actor who kind of came out of nowhere with this interesting, unique, unconventional character and ends up getting a film, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and then ends up getting a TV show, and the TV show ends up winning, it was like 22 Emmy Awards, and it was, the hottest show on television for children, and, all of this merchandise and dolls and things like that. And then, of course, he has this sort of, overnight fall as well. And looking at that kind of story, and at the time that I wrote the book, Paul Rubens, who plays Pee Wee Herman and created Pee Wee Herman, was sort of bringing the character back. He did another film as Pee Wee Herman. He did a Broadway show as Pee Wee Herman. And so that sort of just rise and fall story was sort of interesting to me. And of course, it was something that a show that I really enjoyed watching as a kid, and like in the 70s when you got Grease, which was looking back at the 50s, or, you got Happy Days or things like that. It seemed like there was a little bit of 80s nostalgia also at the time, when I was working on the book. And so the book came out and did pretty well, and people were, it was well reviewed, well received. And that sort of paved the way to the other projects, but they're all, to me, all of those things, and this is, going back to race, I suppose, to an extent, like, all of those shows, even if you didn't watch them, even if you didn't, like them, about E.T., about Back to the Future,
Correct.
About Star Wars, about...
Correct.
These are all things that are just a part of American culture. And while, there have been more efforts to try and change this a little bit in more recent years, but, for a long time, all of these things that we grew up watching, by and large, did have, white people at the center of those stories,
No, that's correct.
A lot of black, action heroes and things like that, unless you were talking about blaxploitation films in the 70s and things like that. So, to me, these were just things that, like, I kind of grew up watching and loving and enjoying. But, that's why it was really kind of exciting to get to work on something like When Broadway Was Black, my newest one, because number one, it was a book where, black people were at the center of it, but also it was a book that looks at a musical, a Broadway musical from 100 years ago, over 100 years ago at this point, that a lot of people don't know existed, but it was a huge hit. And I think the importance to that for me is when we talk about diversity or representation in media or in society, we talk about it like it's new, like it's never happened before. And the fact that, and certainly when you talk about theater and you talk about Broadway, if people don't see themselves in Barnes and Noble, they definitely don't see themselves in Broadway, that's like not, that's not a space where people are necessarily flocking to go. Black people necessarily are flocking to go, by and large. And so it was kind of important to have this book exist and say, no, 100 years ago, the biggest show on Broadway that dominated the conversation was a show with an all-black cast, an all-black creative team, all-black orchestra, producers, that it was that we were there in that space. And if we aren't there now, or if we aren't there now in the same way, maybe it's not about why have we never been there. Maybe it's about how did we get there in the first place, and then what happened over the last 100 years to make us no longer be there, that we need to kind of look at. And so a different kind of project for me, just in terms of like the thesis of it, but it was kind of an important thing for me to do, and I'm glad that that exists and people are enjoying it.
Well, this is the thing. I would be in that crowd of what you were talking about. Most people didn't know about that particular Broadway production 100 years ago. Now, I just didn't know about it until you brought it up. The other thing, going back to what we were talking about a couple minutes prior to you talking about that, because that's what we're going to go to in a minute, was my point in saying that you did Pee-wee and E.T. and Back to the Future and all that. You didn't get pigeonholed or you didn't get typecast. In other words, it wasn't about the fact that you were a black author and the only thing you could write about was the black experience. That's the point I was trying to make. That I think that's great, that we are unlimited. We ought not be limited to one genre or not be limited to one experience or not be limited to writing about only our race. That was the whole point I was making, that I thought it was fantastic that you were able to expand and broaden and to get into a mainstream area. Because you're right, E.T., Back to the Future, Pee Wee Herman, all of that was mainstream. So there's no reason why you as an African American would not be able to tackle or address something that was in the mainstream. That was my whole point. But now that you did say, okay, I want to take a look at it, because I never heard of this play. Because even I had this conversation all the time about Dreamgirls. When Dreamgirls was on Broadway, this is prior to the film. When Dreamgirls is Jennifer Holliday and so forth and so on, when it was originally on Broadway, I saw it. It was back in like the 80s. Back in the 80s. Yeah, it wasn't the 70s. It was in the 80s, maybe 90s, but I think it was 80s. There are some underlying messages in Dreamgirls that most people miss. But the underlying message in Dreamgirls is kind of sort of exactly what you just said, was that our material, our songs, our music, our rhythms was being stolen. It was constantly being stolen. Matter of fact, there's a whole scene in Dreamgirls Cadillac car. Mm-hmm. And that whole scene is really, if you really understood what was going on, it was the whole thing about how our music and everything was being stolen in terms of history, in terms of we roll this out, we bring this out, and now someone else takes it, kind of make it their own form and style and sound and act as if it was theirs. That's kind of what, if you really look at Dreamgirls, what's really going on there. Most people don't pick up on that. But now you're going here, you say, when Broadway was black, the triumphant story of the all-black musical that changed the world. Now, this is interesting because, again, I've never heard of it, I don't think. But so how did you come across that and, research and so forth and so on? Talk us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in 2016, there was actually the slightly fuller version is, as we've talked about, I'm a teacher. I direct the plays at the school that I teach at, the musical there. And so a friend and I were going to do some professional development over the summer. And it was like this 3-day workshop, and part of the workshop where you were going to go see 4 Broadway shows, but you didn't know what shows you were going to go see. You just, they were going to tell you when you got there. So I was incredibly fortunate because one of the shows was Hamilton. One of the shows was On Your Feet, the Gloria Estefan musical. One of the shows was a show called Fun Home, and one of the shows was a show called Shuffle Along, or The Making of the Musical Sensation of 1921, and all that followed. And so we went to go see this show, and it happened to be the Shuffle Along show. It happened to be the day before the show was going to be closing on Broadway. And as a part of this PD experience, I was able to be a part of kind of an audience talk back, and there were only maybe about 40 people in the audience. For the talk back portion. Like it wasn't a big thing. It was really intimate. And, one of the actors, Brian Stokes Mitchell, actually in part of his comments said that it was really disappointing that this show that was meant to sort of honor and celebrate this musical from 1921 was closing prematurely. It was closing after only what would be 100 performances. And, Shuffle Along, the 2016 show, was a show that really, when I went in, I didn't really know very much about it at all. And it wasn't until the end of the first act when they go into this number, and I knew the song. And not only did I know the song, but I really knew the song. And the song was I'm Just Wild About Harry. And so, a lot of people know I'm Just Wild About Harry, and they've heard it from Daffy Duck singing it. They've heard it from, Michigan J. Fogg and the Looney Tunes. They've heard it maybe Judy Garland, maybe Al Jolson, maybe, but how many people, I certainly didn't know, that song was written by two black composers, Noble Sissle and U.B. Blake, and that song was from the first all-black musical to become a hit on Broadway. And so Shuffle Along was a show that when I got back home and started just kind of Googling around like you do, I realized it was Josephine Baker's first professional stage credit when she was only 17 years old.
Wow.
She was a part of this show in the chorus. Langston Hughes, now this is really what blew my mind. Langston Hughes got into a huge fight with his dad when he was a teenager because his dad wanted him to study abroad. He had an opportunity to study abroad, I believe, in Germany. And Langston Hughes fought with his dad, and his dad actually cut him off financially because Langston Hughes chose to attend Columbia University in New York instead of going to study abroad. And the reason why he chose to go to New York is because he wanted to see Shuffle Along.
Wow.
And Langston Hughes, in his autobiography, The Big C, from, I think, 1941, he credits Shuffle Along with single-handedly kickstarting the Harlem Renaissance. He says that it was a show that attracted the best and brightest black talent, not only to be in the show, but then people flocked from around the country to New York to see the show. And so all of these artists from around the country came to Harlem just to be in the proximity of the show, and they would go see the show, and then they would, go uptown, and they would be, in speakeasies and apartment parties and things like that, and that kind of got the art scene jumping in New York for black folks. And the more I kind of learned about this musical, the more I was excited, but then I also was a little bit angry about it, to be honest with you, because I was like, how is it possible?
Correct.
That this exists
and nobody know,
and no one knows.
Correct.
No one. You could walk into, the local supermarket, and you could say, "I'm just wild about Harry," and someone will respond back to you.
Correct.
But you say, okay, now tell me where that's from. And they, like I said, they might say Looney Tunes. They might say, but they're not going to connect it to black people. And that, I thought, was just such a grave injustice, but also kind of representative, just like you were saying with Dreamgirls, kind of representative of what has happened with black art as long as there's been black art.
Correct. Correct.
We know about Elvis. We know about, it just goes on and on and on. And so the book is about the musical, but the book also kind of raises the question just in general about how do we keep letting this happen, or how have we let this happen repeatedly over history, and also how do we make sure that we continue to tell our stories and our history and our truth, and the truth, not just our truth, but the truth, no matter what, the governor of Florida says. How do we continue to do that so that our history does not get lost and buried for another 100 years, for the next, several generations? So,
no, I could not agree with you more, because, see, therein for me, and I said this earlier in terms of the disclaimer, They are my opinions. The views and opinions heard here on the show are solely those of the hosts and guests, and are not necessarily reflective of William Patterson University, Brave New Radio, so forth and so on. But for me, that's the part that is most frustrating, is this, and someone like a DeSantis is trying to do it again. And not just him, as many that they're trying to wash away, or trying to pretend like things that existed did not exist, constantly trying to keep information away from people. As I said, that's counter-education. It's counter-education when you're trying to hide facts. These are facts. This is not something that folks are making up. The fact of the matter is, the song that you just talked about, I'm Wild About Harry, came out of that particular production. All right. The fact of the matter is, that particular play was on Broadway 100 years ago. But folks will try to act as if, no, that wasn't there, it didn't occur, so forth and so on. I mean, you're a history buff, so you know, we have communities that were wiped out. When you start talking Black Wall Street, you start talking the Tulsa Massacre, you start talking folks, things that were wiped out, to act as if they did not exist. And interestingly enough, and one of the things, a couple of years ago, that Dr. Dre came out with an ad for Beats, and they happened to put it during an NFL game. And I'm kind of weird in terms of when I'm watching football or baseball or whatever, I'm actually more interested in some respects to the commercials than I am the game sometime. And this particular day I'm watching, because I'm always looking to see what I can use with my students. This particular day, this ad came on for Beats, and it was Dr. Dre, and the whole thing was about, do you love me or do you love my culture? In other words, everything about me you seem to love, with the exception of me, the person. So you love my music, you love my rhythm, you love my clothing, you love my style, you love my pizzazz, but you claim you don't love me as the person. And so it's like that phenomenon has always kind of like been there. And it seems like it's on a resurgence now, that if folks could wipe out the contributions of other folks, they would. And that's what we're kind of seeing here with, we can't show the Ruby Bridges movie, or we can't, mention the fact that Rosa Parks was an African-American woman, or we can opt out to Black History class. Now, I have yet to see where any of us have gotten to opt out of anything in terms of school. We didn't get to opt out of George Washington. We didn't get to opt out of Abraham Lincoln. We didn't get to opt out of Christopher Columbus. We didn't get to opt out of that. And yet folks right now are trying to opt out of history, opt out of facts. So, the fact that you're writing books, because again, you enlightened me, because I did not know that particular play was in existence, and I did not know that song, because I've heard that song as well. Did not know that song came from there. So as you were doing your research, did you find it difficult to find research, or was it readily available?
Well, it's such a funny question, because, and this was frustrating to me too, because imagine if 100 years from now, someone wanted to write a book on Oprah. Now, let's say 100 years from now, Oprah is gone, and life has moved on in society. Now we've got flying cars, it's the Jetsons, it's a whole different society now. But 100 years from now, someone wanted to write a book on Oprah, and they wouldn't have a hard time doing it once they found the right place to look. All the information would be, they'd be able to see all of her TV shows, they'd be able to see her network, maybe all of her contracts and things would be donated to a library in her hometown or something, or Chicago, and so they'd be there. And so once they went to the Chicago library and all of that, they'd be able to have all the information they wanted, even if society 100 years from now has forgotten about Oprah. And I think what was the most heartbreaking thing for me in writing this particular book was all the information was there. It was, some of it was in an archive in Baltimore. Some of it was in an archive in Atlanta. Some of it was at the New York Public Library. There used to be a very robust Black press in this country, hundreds of different Black-owned newspapers that would cover all aspects of Black life. And I got access to those databases, and the people that wrote this show and created this show were written about almost daily.
Wow. Wow.
And they were just huge celebrities written about around the world, not just in America. And so the fact that their names and their accomplishments have been forgotten, it was made all the more offensive and surprising and hurtful when you realize just how popular they were. And that's why I use Oprah as an example, because, you might say, well, 100 years from now, who could forget about Oprah? But you know what? 100 years is a long time. Think about people that were big celebrities just 20 years ago. You look at,
right.
What were the top movies or what were the top songs from 20 years ago? And I bet you half of those movies or half of those songs you might go, oh, I forgot that thing even existed. I forgot that song. That was always on the playlist. That was always on my iPod or whatever was out 20 years ago. But I've forgotten about that song's existence, because the reality is, as a society, everything moves so fast. We do have a short memory, and especially when, if you are an all-black musical in the 1920s, there sometimes are forces that are accelerating the forgetting, that are working to help people forget. And, I do want to make one more point, because it's relevant to the musical, but it's also relevant just to the broader conversation we're having. When Shuffle Along became a huge hit in the 20s, they went on tour with this show. And I found in my research something that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote for The Crisis, where he was incredibly critical of white theater owners that would not book this show in their theaters around the country. Some would, but some wouldn't. And he said, and I'll never forget this, he said, there are two kinds of ignorance in this country. One kind of ignorance is when you just have never met a black person, you've never been exposed to a black person, you don't know what black people are capable of, and you have a fear, or you have a misconception, or you have a stereotype based on a lack of exposure. The other kind of ignorance is when you know what black people can do, you know what black people are capable of, and you go out of your way, you take active steps to prevent the other kind of people, the other white people that don't know, from knowing. That's the more insidious thing. So if you know that this show is a hit and that audiences will like it and that it will make you money, and you won't book it in your theater because these performers are black, then I take issue, Du Bois is saying, I take issue with you. I can't take the same level of issue with the person who just has never even heard of the show. Well, no, that's absolutely right. And matter of fact, you're going to have to text me or forward me or email me that particular, or either I'll look it up, WEB, because my good frat brother, alpha brother, Du Bois is absolutely correct. Because you use the example of 100 years and now would folks remember Oprah. Now, I would turn it around on you another way in terms of what you were saying about that particular production that was on Broadway 100 years. 100 years from now, will folks know Phantom of the Opera? Will they know Cats? Will they know Les Miserables or Chicago? Mm-hmm. So, maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Where I'm going with this is I don't think efforts would be made, and kind of to the Du Bois quote you were just talking about, I don't think efforts would be made to make sure 100 years from now, folks wouldn't know if you said Phantom of the Opera, what that was. Mm-hmm. Or Cats. Yeah.
I mean, because what I'm hearing from you is it's almost as if, and going back to what I was saying, it's almost as if efforts were made to make sure that you would not know about that particular production 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. Or, even though it was covered every day in the quote-unquote black press, and it wasn't covered in the mainstream press, so Maybe that's why folks didn't know about it. But either way, if the show was that good and you got a song that came out of it that if you hum the tune, everyone knows what it is, then it obviously must have been big. And then the fact that I heard, did you say Eubie Blake?
Yeah.
I heard Josephine Baker as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, some of the top folks had a part in that.
Wilson was in the show for a minute, yeah.
Okay, so that's where I'm going with, Phantom. 100 years from now, folks still might be talking about Phantom of the Opera or Cats or Les Miserables or what have you. Where in 100 years later, we're not talking about the particular production. Was it Shuffle Along? Is that it?
Shuffle Along, yeah.
Shuffle Along, okay. We're not talking about, or folks don't know anything about Shuffle Along until someone like you comes along. Now, going back to the Du Bois quote, it's interesting enough, I downloaded this earlier this morning, which is true to me. This is a quote, I'm not sure who the author of the quote is, but it says, white privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It means that your skin color isn't one of the things making it harder. Now that's deep because, folks are always, white privilege, no. Yeah. Okay, so this one, when I saw this, I said, that puts it really nicely in there in terms of, it doesn't mean that your life hasn't, because people will associate the fact of what you're saying when you start talking about white privilege. Well, your life is great, your life is easy. So what this is saying is, no, white privilege doesn't mean life hasn't been hard. It means that your skin color is not one of the things making it harder. All right. So to me, I saw that it was deep. But the fact, again, going to your researching something, again, that's what I guess historians do. And I'm glad you're bringing it to the forefront. In terms of you now being a teacher in the classroom and you're doing this type of work. And I see here in the bio that you've been on let's see, I saw Entertainment Tonight. I saw Netflix. I see, what was that? Let me see. There was also, what is this? Entertainment Tonight was one. Netflix, the movies. There was something else I thought I saw that you were on. But when your students see that, or if you have the opportunity, because now everything's on YouTube and everything, you can always pull it back up. What are their reactions?
I never really know. They're all very sometimes they're very forthcoming and they say oh my gosh, I saw you on this, I saw you on that. Sometimes they'll see my book at a bookstore or something like that, and
right,
and that's very cool. And I think for me, just as a teacher, and also as you said, as a black man in in New Jersey, it's important for people to know that you can do it. I always had this perception that if you had a book in a bookstore, somehow it got there through magic, it's like having a movie in a theater. People work on it, but how many of us, especially when you're little, how many of us know someone who actually contributed to a movie that is in a movie theater that people pay to see, and
right.
You're wow, someone yeah, it's kind of like a mind-blowing thing. It seems like, it's only reserved for certain people.
Right.
And so to me, that's very important. But I think sometimes the students, to be honest with you, I think what even more so than the students, I think it's their parents sometimes. I've had students come in sometimes with a book and they say my mom wants to know if you can sign this for her, or a kid will come in and say I need to, can I get one of your books for my brother for Christmas? He really enjoys whatever. And so I think it's great that they have someone that they know is a real person that they get to interact with every day, that they can also go see on Netflix, that they can also go see on Amazon or any of the other, book retailers. I think it's important, and I don't know even if they know how important it is.
Correct.
Time,
Correct.
But I do feel like it does matter significantly.
Well, this is why it matters, because you are a living role model right in front of them. And as I started the conversation off with about debunking stereotypes. So now if anyone were to now sit around the dinner table, or either they're out somewhere and they're overhearing conversations of folks talking about what does not, they can turn around and say, no, you're wrong, because my teacher My teacher has been in the New York Times. My teacher has been in the Washington Post. My teacher has been in the Wall Street Journal and on NPR and the Hollywood Reporter, and he is an African-American male. So if nothing else, and even if that particular scenario doesn't happen, the fact that they know that their teacher was able, you never know where they might be aspiring because of you. They might say, well, you know what? That can happen for Mr. Gaines, and I see all this. If I listen to him, I'm in his class, he's my teacher, and I listen to him, it can happen for me too. You just never know because, again, it's about being, a lot of times, particularly in the urban areas, for our children, a lot of times it really is about exposure. Mm-hmm. So they're being exposed to a young man who has, like I said, been in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, NPR, Hollywood Reporter, Entertainment Tonight, Netflix, YouTube, so forth and so on. So this is real life in front of them. I'm getting ready to start school again for the 4th time to get my 4th degree. And one of the reasons in my essay I put in there, I said, because I'm the principal of a school and I want to be a role model for them to say that even Mr. Medley at 60 years old is going back to school again. So it seems like for me, if Mr. Medley could go back to school again, me at 12, 13, 14, I could buckle down and get serious about my education. That is always the hope. So you're a living testimony and role model for your students and the community and everybody else.
Well, I think the big thing too, as you're saying that, it's making me think like, you know, you don't even know when you're a kid all the ways that you receive messages.
Correct.
Information. You know, like I think about how when I was little, I had friends parents rather, that were lawyers and doctors and dentists and things like that. And, you know, and I'm talking about, you know, my friends that were white. And I'm thinking,
right.
You know, even if, you know, your parents are successful, there's still food on the table, you know, it's not necessarily, a poverty level situation, but even so, you look at, you know, perhaps the jobs that some of your friends' parents have or people in your family have, and you look at the jobs that other people have, and even subconsciously, there's got to be a part of you that says, like, okay, well, there's a difference there. You know, there's
right.
a difference. That doesn't mean that it's not attainable. That doesn't mean that you can't do it. That doesn't mean that, you know, like every black parent says to their kid, you know, you can be whatever you want to be when you grow up. That doesn't mean that you don't internalize that too.
Right.
But there's a part of you that has to say, okay, but I don't know any black doctors.
Right.
I don't know any black lawyers.
Right.
I don't know any, you know, like, and so yeah, you're saying I could be whatever I want to be, but like I've never seen a black president. You know,
right?
Until you know, you and I were adults, we never
Correct.
seen a black president. And if you're, you know, a little girl, you've never seen a woman president.
Correct.
Vice president now, but so I do think that you really never know. And in fact, a couple months ago, I got an email from a former student from a long time ago. I've been teaching for 16 years now, so this is probably a student from maybe about a dozen years ago. And the student I remember very well, and the student now is a teacher, actually,
right.
And just wrote to say, you know, they still remember my class. And in fact, the thing that I took the most pride in is that the student said, you know I wasn't the best student in your class.
Correct.
But I remember you always encouraging me to do better.
Correct.
And this is a student that I wouldn't necessarily think would have remembered me or would have certainly reached out after such a long period of time, but you just never know. You know, you never know. And that's why I'm very I think everyone has a story about
Correct.
a teacher or an authority figure. Maybe it's a parent, but someone who is an adult, who is an authority figure, who when they were a kid said something that hurt them, that they never
Correct.
And I just try so consciously, even when I'm frustrated, even when a student is deserving of a talking to.
Correct.
I always just try and be conscious of never using my words in a way where 12 years later, I'm getting an email saying, that thing you said still hurt me.
Correct.
And that I do take very, very seriously.
No, you're absolutely right. I just had this conversation with a student yesterday and said in a different way exactly what you said. In terms of, my students know and this is one of the things I was telling the students, they're like, I am a softie in terms of there are things I know for a fact, if I have the authority to suspend you for, that I'm holding back on because of exactly what you said. And I go have a conversation with them, and the teachers hate it because they feel like, oh my God, he's not suspending. Oh my God. But you just never know. And I've had, just like you, I've had very similar experience. Matter of fact, I walked into a Chipotle one day and one of my kids he says, don't you remember me? I'm such. And I said, yes. He says, yeah, there are times you could have suspended me, but you didn't. He says, you were fair. And absolutely right. I mean, there's just, and you're right. We never know. Our words can go both ways. Matter of fact, this particular child I was talking to, his assignment for the week, because he had broken down because he kept on getting and himself in trouble for making other kids feel bad, for calling them names or for whatever. And he literally was upset with himself because he just kept doing. I said, well, this is your assignment for the week. We're on spring break this week. Your assignment for this week is to make sure you don't say anything mean to anybody, that everything that comes out of your mouth towards somebody else is going to be either a compliment or something nice, but you're going to make a conscious effort not to say anything mean about your classmates or your mom or your dad or your grandmother or your teachers or whoever. So that was the deal we made for the week, and that is his assignment, that he cannot say anything mean, because it really is a practice. And you're right, in terms of we just never know who we are impacting. Now you, because you are in multiple roles, because usually I will say as an author, you really are setting a legacy. But you're putting your legacy in place in multiple ways by being a teacher. That's setting up a legacy. The fact that your work, your books and everything is still going to be here when you're gone, that's setting up a legacy. So that's why we do what we do, in terms of even when we're gone, the works that we did, if they're positive works, will still speak for us. And so I am more than proud of you, more proud than you can actually know, because the progression is there. I'm sitting here listening to you and how well spoken you are, because I teach public speaking, and there's very few ams and ums and repeating yourself that I've heard throughout the interview. And you've been making all kinds of sense. You've been making all kinds of cogent and relevant commentary and remarks. And again, that's not what folks try to portray African American males to be able to do and be. And the fact that you're standing in front of other children, regardless of what color they are, and you're standing in front of them and you're acting as that role model to say, our teacher was on the Hollywood Reporter. Our teacher has written books. Because the other thing is, you're also promoting the very thing that you're teaching, which is reading in English and language arts, so forth and so on. Yeah. So they're able to connect the dots to say, this is why I need to study this.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the other thing, too, that's coming to mind is just like you're saying about suspension, Mr. Medley could have suspended me, but he didn't. Our kids are too often not given second chances.
Correct.
In society. When you look at how many cases, how many situations, how many incidents, whatever the word is that you want to use to describe when there are black males or black people that are suspected of crimes or suspected of being up to no good, and people take action against them and then ask questions later.
Correct.
Because and then even in death, those people, oftentimes those young people, are still vilified and their past is held against them, and they're not given an opportunity for any sort of redemption or second chance. It is important for our kids to see that there are people that are just willing to say, you are more than your worst behavior.
Correct.
You are more than your biggest mistake. you are more than what you did 10 minutes ago, that you are a person and people make mistakes and people are deserving of second chances. Now,
correct.
50 and 60 chances, maybe not that many, but you know, it is important. And I think, I do believe that changes the way someone thinks about themselves.
Correct. You're absolutely right. Well, man, it has been a blast. We're down to the last couple minutes of the interview, and this is what I do at this point. I give you the opportunity to promote in any way you like. The only limitation, the only thing you cannot do is say a dollar amount. But as far as shouting anybody out, your contact information, your websites, your books, where they're available, where you're going to be, book signings, anything you want with the exception of the dollar amount, I'm going to shut the mic off, and you have the opportunity to do that, and then we're done.
No problem. Well, thank you so much for having me back. It has been my pleasure. And my name is Caseen Gaines. I am the author of When Broadway Was Black, all about the 1921 musical Shuffle Along. And that book and all of my other books are available wherever books are sold. But if you go to my website, which is Caseen Gaines, CASEENGAINES.com, you can find all those books there, and there are links to check them out. And also, if you happen to be in the New York City area on May 21st, that's right. No, I'm sorry, May 22nd. I knew I was getting that wrong. May 22nd, I am actually producing a concert of music from Shuffle Along at 54 Below, a great venue in New York City. All Broadway actors performing music from this Broadway show. And the very next day, on May 23rd, there is a book signing at the Drama Bookshop in Manhattan as well. And the son of Shuffle Along's lyricist, Noble Sissel, will be hosting the concert and also will be joining me for the book signing. So if you're in the area, come check us out, and thank you so much.
All right, man, I might try to get that on my calendar and get there for one of them, either one or both, but certainly maybe for the book signing or something. So I'll have to definitely keep in touch with you on that, because I may try to get out there for that. But again, man, so proud of you. I don't know what to do. Don't know what to do. Your mom ought to be proud. I remember your Aunt Stacy, and she's gone on, but I know your family ought to be extremely proud of you, because I know I am. And man, just, you know, as my mom can always say, keep on keeping on.
I appreciate you.
All right, man. Have a wonderful day. We will be in touch. If everything recorded the way I wanted to, I'll get it to you. I put it on my YouTube channel, and it's archived there, so folks who didn't rise early with us can hear it again later. I'm definitely going to be promoting folks to take a listen to this, because first off, you were so well spoken, and secondly, we hit so many different issues within the whole notion of your latest book. All right. So once I get that edited and up and going, I will get it out to you, and you can do what you want with it when you get it.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Have a great week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right.